Bruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Lamed Daled Amud Beis. 13 lines from the top, 2 lines before it gets wide on the Amud. The Gemara goes back to the Mishnah in Trumois that states when there is a planting of Truma and that plant is now outside of the ground, it has been dislocated and it is edible. Let's say it's cabbage leaves. And it can be then replanted. While it is outside of the ground, before it becomes replanted, it becomes tameh. So this truma planting that is now tameh, once it is replanted, the ruling of the Mishnah is that it is something that no longer is tameh. However, it is aser be'achila. So Rav Sheshes explains it's aser even for the kohanim to eat. If it no longer is tameh and it's only truma, so kohanim should be able to eat it. Why is it prohibited for the kohanim to eat? Says Rav Sheshes, because we're talking about hesech hadas. Since truma requires, and so too kodshim, requires shmira, and once the truma plant is replanted, once it's already tameh, so therefore it's no longer somebody who protects it. He's no longer watchful of this truma. So therefore, there's considered to be hesach hadas, a diversion of his attention, which renders it to become something that is no longer feasible to be eaten. That's what Rav Sheshes explains. Says the Gemara now. Kisolik Ravin, when Ravin went up from Bavel to Eretz Yisrael, Amr l'shmaitze kamed Rabbi Yirmiyahu. He said over the shmaitze we just said now in the name of Rav Sheshes, before Rabbi Yirmiyahu. Omar, Rabbi Yirmiyahu responded, Bavloi tipshoi, the foolish Babylonians. Mishum diyaspe ba'aret dechashucha, amrisun shmaiti demachshuchu. Because they are living in a land that is dark, so too then they make up reasons for things that are not correct, which are also considered to be things that are a dark, so to speak, reasoning. Because lo shmiya l'chu hod de Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish mishmid Rabbi Yoshaya. Did they not hear what Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said in the name of Rabbi Yoshaya? Which explains this Mishnah in Trumais for why it is that the kohanim cannot eat this truma. When it comes to Sukkot, there are water libations, nische hamayim, and when the water is prepared before Shabbos for Shabbos, and we're talking about a situation where, after all, this water now becomes tameh. So now there's a question what to do with this water that's tameh that needs to be used for the mizbeach. So it states over here that they can put it inside of the amas hamayim, which is a mikvah in the azara of the Beis Hamikdash, and that will do what's called a hashaka. That will then cause the waters to then connect, whereby it'll then take away the tumah from the water. Then they can go ahead and subsequently use that water for libations. So says the Gemara, the waters of Sukkot, again, the nische hamayim, they're going to be nische hamayim, they became tamei on Shabbos. Hishikan v'achakach hikdishan taharin. If they put it inside of the waters of the amas hamayim, the canal that exists in the azar as a mikvah, then that will be valid to make the waters tahor. However, in the opposite direction, hikdishan v'achakach hishikon tmein. But if they first were makdish the water to be used for the libations, and then they put it as hashaka in the water of the canal inside the azara, then the waters will remain tameh. Michti, Rabbi Yirmiyahu then asks, let us try to analyze, let us see. Zriya ninhu. This is a form of zriya. It's called this hashaka. When the tameh water enters into water of mikvah, that's called hashaka. It's also referred to as zriya. So he says, this zriya, he explains, what does it make a difference in what the order is? If it first is going to be hishikon, where you put the waters in, and then you're makdish those waters for yayin for mayim nesachim, nische hamayim, or the opposite, if you first are makdish and then you put them into the waters. Alma, Rabbi Yirmiyahu comes and explains, therefore, ein zriya lehekdesh. So we see from here that indeed, since it was first hekdesh, and then we put it into the waters, the mikveh water, it does not become tahor, because we don't say zriya when it comes to hekdesh. So too over here, in regards to the case of truma. After all, even though it's now tameh, this plant, truma plant, is tameh, we when then go ahead and replant it, it does not take away the tumah fully. In other words, it's not going to be metameh, but it will not be mutter ba'achil, and therefore even a kohen can no longer eat from such plants. So he wants to now explain what we said before, and he argues on Rav Sheshes said, Yossi Rav Dimi v'ka'amar lo hashmaitza. Rav Dimi said over the shmaitza, as what just was explained, Omar le Abaye. Abaye said, Hikdishon bekli ka'omar, aval bepeh loy avud rabbanim maila. Abaye has a question. After explaining that which Rav Ashaya said, Rav Ashaya said the name of Rav Ashaya, he wants to know the following. That which we just say, when you're makdish it in a kli, is that when they were machmir and made a stringency and say that it does not then become something that is valid? Is that, he says, only because they are makdish it? In other words, it has a status of kedushas haguf, which is a high level status of kedusha. Aval bapeh loy ovud rabbanan maila. But if it was only kedusha bapeh, it would be a lower status of kedusha, we'll call kedush damim. That would not be something that they would make a stringency for. Or ask Abai, maybe just the stringency of the even of the kedusha of the peh. The hainu, if you make something hekdesh, which would be kedushas damim, that itself also would have the stringency. This is Abaye's question. Or marlei zulo shamati. He responds to Abaye and he says, I don't know. I didn't hear this directly. I don't know directly in terms of this case. But keyoytse bo shamati. But I did hear something similar that would answer indeed this question, that the peh, kedusha of the peh, which would be kedusha's dummy, would be enough to make it so that they were stringent. Dom Rabbi Abo Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Abo said in the name Rabbi Yochanan, Anovim shenitmu drochan v'achar kach hikdishon taharim. You have anovim, grapes that are tameh, and they then are pressed. Afterwards, they still remain kadosh. In other words, Rabbi Yochanan is of the shita that says that when it comes to the juice inside of the grapes, so we say mifkad pokid, it's like they are deposits, little deposits of grape juice inside of the grapes, which makes it independent of the grapes. So like we learned in the previous Amud, therefore you can be darich these grapes that are themselves tameh, without them coming to then metameh, the juice that comes outside. So the Gemara understands over here that Rabbi Yochanan is talking about a case where he pressed these grapes, and he did so, and as Mekadesh, then they were for Laim Nesachim. However, if he did in the opposite order, Hikdishon, if he was first Makdish them for Yain Nesachim, again for Hekdesh, V'achakach Dorachan Tmein, and afterwards he went ahead and he pressed these grapes, then they would be Tmein. Ay v'ho anovim v'kedushas peh ninu. So we can bring a raya from Rabbi Yochanan that this is Kedushas HaPeh. He was coming to makdish this to be used for Yain Nisachim. And indeed we say over here, it's still going to be Osir. So we see over here that we do see the stringency that Chachamim made, even when it comes to Kedushas Damim. In other words, it cannot have Kedushas Haguf over here, because over here it wouldn't be able to be put into a Kli Shares to become Kedushas Haguf, because grapes themselves don't have any type of service on the Mizbeach. The service on the Mizbeach is the Yayin Nesachim, the juice that comes out of the grapes. So therefore over here we're talking about Kedushas HaPeh. So l'char we have a raya that when it comes to Kedushas HaPeh, we do say the stringency, the mile of the Chachamim. Rav Yosef, he challenges and he says, Anovim ka'amris. Are you saying Anovim? Are you saying over here that this is a kedushas of kachim? This is not talking about kachim over here. This is not the case of kachim. Hacha be'anovim shel truma askinan. Here we're talking about grapes of truma. The kedushas peh nidu kedushas kli damya. And when it comes to the kedusha of truma, which is niskadesh ayidei the peh, that is the same level of kedusha of kachim that is with a kli, and therefore has the same degree of kedusha called kedushas haguf. So therefore, you have no raya that the kedushas hapeh they were machmir. Aval hani de boy kli, but these referring to the mei hachag, the waters of the nischei hamayim on Sukkis, that was put into a kli, and therefore they need a kli to become kodesh. And perhaps, therefore, when it comes to the Kedushas HaPeh, the Rabban did not say a mile, did not say a stringency. So we have no raya from Rabbi Yochanan that indeed the Kedushas HaPeh is enough to make a stringency. Says the Gemara, now asking on the statement we just said before, in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that you can be dorech the anovim. Ask the Gemara, dorchin v'afilu tuva. Here, Rabbi Yochanan did not make a distinction. He just says they were dorech, the anovim that were nitzma'u, that were tmeim. Ask the Gemara, afilu tuva, even a large amount of grapes. Ask the Gemara, umi omar Rabbi Yochanan hachi. Did Rabbi Yochanan say that this is so that you can go ahead and dores, you can go ahead and dorchan on the grapes, and thereby the juice will not become tamei as a result? He stated that the only reason why you can go ahead and dorech on these grapes, and that the grapes that are tamei will not produce the juice from being tamei, it'll remain tahor, is only because pachos mikabetza. In other words, again, he holds mifkad pokid, that there are little deposits of juice within the grapes, and therefore those little bags, so to speak, of juice, they are independent of the grapes themselves. So therefore, when you squeeze the grapes, even though the grapes themselves are tamei, the juice is not tamei. However, when is it so that it remains that the juice is tahor? Only when it's pachos machos b'kabetza, because if it's a kabetza, then the kabetza has the power to make tameh as an oichel to metameh the juice. So therefore, it can only be that it's pachos mekabetza. This is what we learned on the previous Amud. And incidentally, parenthetically, this is really the reason why we're bringing the whole sugya, because the Gemara brings back Rabbi Yochanan's statement that was made on Daf Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph, or Lamed Dalet Lamed Gimel Amud Aleph, I believe. Ibois Eima. The Gemara answers, you're right, Rabbi Yochanan was not talking necessarily about the fact that he's dorech grapes in any amount. Here it's also talking about where it's pachos mikabetza, and that's why the juice that comes out remains tahor. Or you can say perhaps that we are talking about a large amount, because Hasam over there, when Rabbi Yochanan said has the pachos mikabetza, it's talking about the nagul Berishon, it's talking about where somebody was rishon the tuma. That means that he came in contact, let's say, with a mace, tmei mace. He became a rishon, and then he had contact with the grapes. So then making the grapes into a sheni. And therefore the sheni grapes, if they were going to then come in contact with the mashkin that would come out of the grapes, they would metameh them, make them into a rishon midrabanan. But over here, the nagu sheni dahavulish lishi. But over here, we're talking about a case where the person who was pressing the grapes was himself only a sheni, making the grapes into a shlishi. Those grapes cannot go ahead and in turn metameh the mashkin. So therefore, even if it's going to be a larger amount of a kibetza. Omar Rave, the Rave said, Af ananami tanina. We also learn that indeed, he's saying, we can learn from a brisa that indicates that the kedushas hapeh also, they were machmir, they made a maila. it says in the Pasuk, in regards to Mechatos, it says, V'nosan alov mayim chayim el keli. And they will put the ashes, it's talking about, I'll read the whole Pasuk. The Pasuk says, V'lochu latem tamei be'ofar sreifas hachatos. They take the efer hapara, the ashes of the para aduma, and it says over here, V'nosan alov mayim chayim el keli. And they would put mayim chayim onto the ashes in the kli. Mayim chayim refers to spring water. So here the Bryce explains, V'nosan alov mayim chayim el keli. Says the Bryce, that the water has to be direct from the spring water into the kli without an intermediary. Yet it says V'nosan al matlushininu, which implies that it is taken from a kli, the spring water, and then placed into this kli. Seems to be a contradiction. Is the water directly attached from the spring, or is it now drawn into another kli, which is now put into this kli? Rather, the Torah is giving us a maila. So rather we see that the Chachamim are making a maila. That means that the Chachamim learn out from this brisa, learning out that there's a maila, that over here that you make it that it's mechubar, and they made a certain stringency, even though the Torah itself says that it can be taken from another kli in and then brought into this kli as an intermediary. Yet they were machmir, they were stringent. Hachanami maila. So too over here in regards to our case, when the truma planting is replanted. So even though that truma tmeya that was replanted, it doesn't fully lose its status of tuma. So although it doesn't metame, but it cannot be eaten even by a kohen. Omar Rav Shimi bar Ashi. We also learned this to be true. Toval ve'ola oichel b'maiser. Somebody who was tamei, who was toivel, and he came out of the mikvah, he can eat maiser sheni. Heriv shimshoy oichel b'truma. Once the sun sets, he can also then eat truma if he's a kohen. B'truma in b'kachim loy. Only b'truma, but not b'kachim. Amai asked the Gemara, tahor who? He is tahor. Ella maila hachanami maila. Rather, you see that the Torah itself makes it so that there's a maila stringency. So too the Chachamim by us also made a stringency when it comes again to the planting of truma temeya. Although it's replanted, that truma doesn't lose its complete status of being tamei. Rather, it is something that cannot be metama other things, but a kohen cannot eat it, and therefore it has a status somewhat of being tamei still because of this stringency. Omar Rav Ashi says, Af anan nami tanina. We also learned this principle. Vahabosar, it states in the Pasuk, I'll read you the Pasuk. It states, Vahabosar sheyiga bekol tamei lo ye'ochel. The bosar that has been in contact with anything that is tamei shall not be eaten. Ba'esh yisarev, you shall burn it in the fire. Vehabosar kol tohor yoichal bosar. And the bosar of anybody who's torah may eat the bosar. This is called out a korban shlomim. So says the Gemara. Amar Ravashi afananami tanino vehabosar. It states vehabosar with the extra vav. L'rabois es ha'etzim ulevoina, to include that which you came in contact with something that is tamei, not only food but even etzim and levoina. Although etzim and levoina are not a food and it's not a kli, nonetheless it becomes tamei. Etzim levoina b'nei itmoyaninu. That's what the Gemara asks. Is it etzim and levoina? Are those things that are something that can become tamei? Again, they're not a food item and they're not a kli. Ela maila hachanami maila. Rather, we see that it was made a maila. So too over here, in regards to the plantings of truma temeya, although they are replanted, we made a stringency. The Chacham made a stringency and said they are still going to remain tamei to eat, and therefore the kohen cannot eat such truma.